hard to believe that Final Fantasy 16 is already a year old. It seems like just yesterday everybody was hyped for the launch event and the demo that would eventually release later that night. That anticipation of getting a new entry in the series is like no other. At launch, Final Fantasy 16 reviewed very well. The reactions were mostly positive, and for the first time it seemed like everybody was enjoying it. Flash forward now and it seems like the opinions are a lot more varied and the criticisms are a lot louder. And some of those criticisms I actually do agree with because Final Fantasy 16 isn't a perfect game. However, I also do think there are a lot of criticisms that are pretty disingenuous and unfair to the overall experience of this game. I found that even with its flaws, I still really enjoyed my first playthrough. And there are many aspects of this game that I believe can hold a candle to some of the peaks of the series. But in order to get the full picture of Final Fantasy 16, we gotta go back to the beginning, the development. Now, I am someone who has grown up with the franchise and have played almost all of the Final Fantasy games at this point. With the exception of Final Fantasy XI and some spin-off games here and there, I would like to think that I am pretty well versed in this series. And with each title comes their own positives and negatives. For instance, Final Fantasy XIII had to work with its problematic game engine, Crystal Tools, aka the Dark Ages of Square Enix. Not to mention that it threw away its more open-zoned, overworld approach for a far more linear experience. Or with Final Fantasy XV with its infamous development cycle and its lack of direction or coherency in its narrative. And don't get me wrong, I love Final Fantasy XV, but the story was definitely not one of its strong suits. Instead, the Brotherhood really kept that game together for me. And at the end of it all, I still enjoyed my time with it despite its problems. As a result of the reception that came with 15, Final Fantasy XVI was in many ways a direct response to those criticisms. The one thing that Creative Studio 3 absolutely didn't want to repeat was having a disjointed, incomplete story once again. One that didn't have important storylines locked behind animes, movies, and books, but a game that had a beginning, middle, and end all in one package at launch. And instead of having DLC filling in gaps of the story, 16s was added not to complete the story, but to service the world and the lore that could be built upon. And while Final Fantasy XVI worked hard to not repeat the mistakes of the past, instead they ended up creating mistakes of their own. To be fair, there are some really good criticisms by at least reasonable people that I can actually agree with. When it comes to exploration, game design, and the lack of RPG elements and systems, I can definitely agree with a lot of those criticisms. And yet, even despite those flaws, I believe this is a solid Final Fantasy. Everything that it strives to do and everything that it gets right is some of my favorite in the series. And ultimately, this game is a good depiction of what this franchise represents. Free will, the themes of Final Fantasy XVI. The themes of a story, especially with Final Fantasy, give you a quick and better understanding of a story and what it's all about. They give you a deeper appreciation of the characters and the world around them. For instance, when you look at what Final Fantasy XIV is about, one of its main themes is fighting against despair. To live is to suffer through the trials of life, and to come to the realization that there is no one single answer for what it means to live. In some ways, Final Fantasy XVI's themes are pretty similar in that it's all about free will, the ability to live your life on your own terms and to have that empathy for those around you. It's the way in which Final Fantasy XVI portrays those themes throughout the course of the story as to why I love it so much. It resonates with me because, hey, I'm a young adult. I know that I will stumble and I will fail, but that perseverance in struggling to live life on your own terms despite the challenges and the hardships. And though there are many themes to Final Fantasy XVI, that message and that takeaway is something that makes this game so special to me. And in the game, whether you're fighting against the Empire, fighting against the natural order of the world, or in your typical Final Fantasy fashion, fighting against a god who represents the opposite of those themes, or opposes that idea. After multiple playthroughs, it even gave me a deeper appreciation for the villain of the story after I really came to understand the message 16 wanted to convey. But I'll speak more about the villain and his relation to the themes later in the video. The story and plot of Final Fantasy XVI. In this tale, set in the world of the twin continents of Valisthea, you follow the main protagonist, Clive Rosfield, firstborn prince of the Grand Duchy of Rosaria, a slave to the Empire turned revolutionary against the natural order of the world. And in this world, there are 8 summons that play a major role in the story. Their importance to the plot of 16 is equivalent to that of Final Fantasy X, and how integral the summons were in helping Yuna fight back against Sin. And in this game, each kingdom uses these summon beasts, which in 16 are called Eikons, as weapons to use for war against their neighboring nations. However, unlike past Final Fantasy games where the summons are a separate entity, 16 does something unique to where a person can transform into these iconic beasts. And these individuals are referred to as dominants. If I remember correctly, it's also pretty similar to Final Fantasy XIV and how some characters with the Echo and with enough ether can transform into a summon. Aside from dominants, there are also individuals called bearers, who, despite not being able to wield the might of an icon, can still use magic. Unlike in other Final Fantasy games where magic users are revered and protected, in this world, magic users, including dominants, are treated as slaves for their power. And the main conflict of 16 derives from a magical drought known as the Blight that is rapidly turning the 2 continents of Valisthea into wastelands. And amongst that chaos, each nation is fighting over that dwindling resource. After finding the determination and the empathy to fight for those around him, Clive Rosfield and party set out on a quest to rid the land of magic so that the rest of the world of men can live and die on their own terms. In some ways, it has an environmentalist message to it like Final Fantasy VII, and how a heavy reliance on technology can destroy the world around you, all while driving home the main themes of 16 forward in free will and choice. And I think it just works so well in 16. Again, a lot of the stuff that Final Fantasy 16 represents, especially in its narrative, is stuff I love seeing in Final Fantasy. They aren't afraid of taking the sensitive topics and harsher realities of the real world and incorporating that into a story that people will never forget. The main characters. Now, when it comes to the main characters of Final Fantasy XVI, I think the entire cast is done very well. I didn't think there was one character in this game that was just straight up bad or that their writing was atrocious in any way. They all had something that I was interested in and kept me watching when they were on screen. Clive as a character is probably one of my favorite protagonists in Final Fantasy now, because not only is his writing and his development amazing, but the time skips within the story serve his character very well. Clive isn't the same person he is as a teenager, and when you see him at age 28, this is a man who has lost himself. He has no purpose, and the only thing that has kept him going was to find the dominant of Ifrit, the person responsible for destroying his homeland. It's only when he meets a character named Cid that he slowly finds his purpose again, and by the age of 33, Clive finds himself a leader of a revolution. It's really this last time skip that shows how different Clive carries himself in comparison to when he was 28. His entire attitude has changed as a result of the circumstances within those 5 years. And yet, even as a man, as a leader, you still see the turmoil within his character. He still doesn't fully understand this role he's taken up, and even the people around him who he cares about are suffering, like Jill, who at this point is showing signs of the crystal's curse, which is what all magic users suffer from when overusing their magics. It is such a great approach to his character because even when he's already gone through so much growth, he is still learning how to save those that he truly loves. And so even when you think he has it all figured out, he really doesn't. And to watch that growth constantly happening throughout the story is amazing to see. Of course, his character wouldn't have been half of what it was without the amazing acting by Ben Starr. I mean, one of, if not some of the best acting I've experienced in any video game. And his performance genuinely blew me away.
She was every waking moment was spent trying to shoulder the burden that you and the Phoenix and the Duchy foisted on him. That's why I became his shield. To help bear the weight. But what did you do? You betrayed your own blood and surrendered your son to his fate!
Jill is someone that I also really enjoyed as a character as well. She essentially goes through the same trauma as Clive. They're both slaves to a master for 13 years, and even more so than Clive, Jill's power gets used for war constantly within that span of time. And as a result of that, it makes her extremely weak throughout the rest of the game. And through many of those scenes, especially throughout the middle of the game, you can tell that she's constantly suffering. Yet in spite of all this, chooses to help Clive in his quest to save this dying world. A world that discards them as tools. I think Jill is a very interesting character to me because despite what she went through, she's the one who is constantly picking up Clive. It's that relationship between Clive and Jill that really makes both of their characters stand out immensely. She keeps him grounded and she is the voice of reason for Clive. She's able to look past the monster within herself because of Clive, because she believes in him even when he doesn't himself. In many ways, their stories are two sides of the same coin. And though she may be very underutilized in the last handful of hours of the game, I still really enjoyed her character. His brother Joshua is the heir to Rosaria, but he's also the Phoenix. Not only is Clive his brother, but he's also a squire shield sworn to protect him should anything happen, as he is the dominant of the Phoenix. Other than that, I can't really go into much detail about his character, as that would spoil a lot of reveals and twists throughout the game. And of course, we can't forget about the GOAT himself, Sid. To be honest with you, not only is he one of the best characters in the game, but he's probably one of the best Sids in the entire franchise. His character is the catalyst for the main plot and the themes of the story. Without him, Clive and Joe wouldn't have been able to see this other perspective of the world, the plight of bearers, or even the effects of the blight itself. Sid carries himself like a proud leader, yet underneath that hard exterior is a man with a lot of mistakes. Mistakes that he hopes that Clive doesn't repeat in the future. He is the mentor to both Clive and Jill throughout the beginning of the story. And without spoiling anything, all I'll say is that he is a fantastic character and an amazing Sid. The other dominants. The villains are very interesting because they are presented as the oppressors to Clive and party to contrast the themes of the game. However, the irony of that is that each of the villains in the story are actually all slaves to something as well. Benedicta is portrayed as a really bad woman. Her outfit resembles that of her Eikon, with feathers going around the collar with a full black leather suit. Although Benedicta preaches of how important loyalty is, she's become so obsessed with that concept that she's turned into the one thing she's hated. Benedicta is a great villain. She is the one who plays all sides and manipulates anybody useful to King Barnabas, who is another villain and a dominant in the story. What I love about her character the most is that all of her actions never seem to be black and white. For instance, some part of her does understand that Barnabas is just using her for her power, yet she clings to her loyalty. That fear of reverting back to her old self frightens her more than anything. She'd rather stay at the top and be used than to go back to her past life. Her character alone represents how tragic the world of Final Fantasy XVI really is. Hugo Kupka is shown to be the strong, intimidating man whose will and tough demeanor is stronger than stone. Yet he falls victim to the manipulations of love, and through the course of the game you start to see the cracks form in his hardened persona. Hugo's appearance is that of high standing. He wears lots of jewelry to drive home that fact and appears confident and strong like a dominant of Titan should be. His exterior is everything you would expect from the dominant of Titan. He is an intimidating and very large man, yet once you get to know his character, it is quite the opposite. Dion is both a dragoon and a prince of the Empire formed by duty and loyalty. A very honorable man that would do anything for his people. Also the dominant of Bahamut. The thing about Dion is that he is a very tragic character, because he is just a man trying to do the right thing for his country, yet is thrown around the realm to assert the Empire's dominance and control more of the Mother Crystals. Nobody sees him as more than just a weapon to use for war. Barnabas is the king of the eastern continent of Valencia. Of course, he is also the strongest out of all of the dominants, being the dominant of Odin. Everything that Barnabas does is for his religion and his god. He acts as the soldier and messenger of a bigger evil in the story, only to act when his master gives him a task. Barnabas's design wears black and purple garments. And when he's primed, he looks much different than any of the dominants that take this form. Instead, unlike the other dominants, his form gives him a knight in armor appearance, while also making him significantly taller. What makes me enjoy his character is the fact that we as the player have to recognize that this is a man far gone. He has given up on humanity and is in direct opposition to the themes of the game. He believes that free will is the root of all problems within humanity and chooses to give up on them because of that fact. He may not be everyone's favorite character, but to me, he is a breath of fresh air. Because we aren't necessarily supposed to like him more than we are to pity him for the man that he has become because of the circumstances of the world. The main villain. A deep dive on Ultima. And that brings me to the main villain of Final Fantasy XVI. This is a character that I feel a lot of people misunderstand and as a result don't enjoy as much as others. However, that is one of the main points to their character. It's the fact that you can't really understand them as a collective. Ultima is an alien in every sense of the word. Even though they created us, they truly cannot understand concepts such as empathy or free will. To them, it is a cancer and a plague within humanity that must be excised. They see their creations as flawed, and they make sure to make that very clear throughout the story. The writers here have really crafted a being that is truly otherworldly, the epitome of what an alien could really be like, which is why every time Ultima tries to claim Clive as his vessel, and Clive refuses, Ultima is truly baffled by this. He is confused because these are his creations, so the fact that they have gained a will of their own truly perplexes Ultima. Even down to his appearance, Ultima is unlike anything you've experienced in the game up to this point. His arms and his long nails, his pale skin and bulging veins, and the fact that he can fly. What's even more frightening than that is the fact that anytime Ultima talks or looks at someone, it is never done with emotion. When he talks, it is always monotone, and when he looks at you, it is always with the same expression, as if every part of his body is a machine only to be used for one purpose. It's that absence of empathy or emotion that truly makes his appearance on screen that much more unnerving. Throughout the game, Ultima is portrayed as this ultimate life form whose will is absolute, a life form that is beyond the comprehension of feelings or emotion. However, there is one emotion that Ultima could never escape from, one that has ruled over him since the beginning. That emotion is fear. It was that fear of death that made him flee his world and escape to Valencia. It's that same fear that pushes them so hard to create this new world, this new paradise away from the Blight so that they never have to feel fear again. It's what makes the final fight so satisfying because you get to see the cracks form in Ultima's godlike persona. It's as Ultima is losing this fight to Clive that they realize they had created a species that could far surpass their divinity. This being, Logos, that Clive represents is the epitome of free will, and that is something that absolutely terrifies Ultima. Throughout the fight, Ultima tries to fight back against it, becoming even more panicked as the fight goes on. It's that change in demeanor during this section that proves that even Ultima can feel afraid of death.
You're afraid. You always have been. From the moment the Blight exposed what you were, weak, you conceived us to prove otherwise. But the result shook you to the core. For in us you saw yourself, and realized we had the potential to be more than you could ever be. And so you turned your back on your creation, your back on the world, like the coward you are.
You think you know me? You know nothing, Logos. Nothing.
Their entire motivation as a collective was self-preservation, and once faced with this insurmountable obstacle in front of them, the thought of not being able to complete this plan thousands upon thousands of years in the making horrifies him. He can do nothing but panic and feel fear, that one overwhelming emotion that ultimately leads to his downfall. It is in Ultima's last moments where he lay dying on the ground that has become one of my favorite scenes in the game. With creation standing above creator, they have one last final confrontation. And this is such a great scene because it's almost as if Ultima wants to understand humanity here. They even express how confused they are that Clive fought for this freedom, even though Clive knows that this newfound freedom won't be a peaceful one.
Tell me, what do you imagine will befall this world now that you have gained your precious freedom?
I honestly don't know. but I doubt it will be pretty. A sorry tale of sin and suffering, hardship and pain.
And it was for this that you fought so fiercely? Why?
It's who we are. We fight. We survive. We endure. We don't need a reason. We are imperfect creatures. When we stumble, we reach for a shoulder to lean on. When we fall, we stand back up. We see the horizon, ever out of reach, and still we march on. Certain the answers lie just beyond it, because that is our way.
And I absolutely love this scene because it's almost as if Clive is teaching Ultima in this moment, away from the spectacle and the action, and all it is a quiet conversation between creator and creation. To live life is to experience pain, and with that life comes adversity. In this world that Clive has fought so hard for away from Ultima's influence is definitely one of pain and hardship. However, it is friendship, love, and empathy that makes all of that pain worth it. Clive accepts the imperfections and hardships that will inevitably come of free will, because that is life. We fight, we survive, we endure. We don't need a reason, because that is our way. It is those imperfections that Ultima failed to embrace, and why at the end of it all, he stands defeated. The combat system. Now, with this game comes one of the most exciting yet divisive combat systems in the franchise. I myself am someone who really enjoys both turn-based and action combat. So when this game was revealed to not only be an action game, but an action game made by one of the combat designers of Devil May Cry 5, I was all on board, because that is one of my favorite action games of all time. Final Fantasy XVI is the first true combo action game in the series. Unlike Final Fantasy XV, which was sort of a unique mix between turn-based and action, though not as good of a mix as something you would see in the remake trilogy. With 16, they just went all in on the action combat, and it shows. Although it's not as complex of a combat system you would see in Devil May Cry 5, the versatility and the combo potential that you can pull off in this game is almost limitless. It reminds me a lot of the gameplay and the freedom that you have in Kingdom Hearts. To this day, Kingdom Hearts 2 remains some of the best action games I've played, and some of the best that Square Enix has made. And I'd say with 16, the action combat definitely sits up there for me. It is by far the fastest and most fluid gameplay within the series. And of course, like a lot of the HD Final Fantasies, we also see a return to the stagger system. The meat of the combat really comes from the 8 icons you can unlock in the game. You can choose to equip up to 3 icons, and all of them are different and offer a unique playstyle for the player. I cannot stress how well done the icon system is here. For every person that I see play this game, all of their setups are different. I have seen some discourse that the combat itself doesn't have depth, and that is where I disagree. It isn't the combat itself that lacks depth, but the systems and the mechanics that revolve around it. The problem that Final Fantasy XVI's gameplay runs into is its variety and enemy mechanics and difficulty. For most of the enemies in Final Fantasy XVI, all you really have to do to kill them is to just keep hitting them until they die. There really isn't anything unique to mechanics when it comes to enemies, and the difficulty here doesn't help either. The game is very easy with pretty much little to no challenge within the combat whatsoever, and that is very unfortunate because the combat itself is extremely versatile and very well done. I've been playing the new Kairos Gate mode on the hardest difficulty, and that mode alone proved how important a harder difficulty was in the game. It's definitely a mode that really pushes you to bring out the most in the combat, especially if you're on the Final Fantasy difficulty. Aside from that, there really isn't a lot that really pushes you to bring out the most in the gameplay, but in those rare instances where it does, like the Kairos Gate mode and other bosses such as Omega and Leviathan, it really drives home just how important a harder difficulty difficulty is in a game like this. One more minor gripe to get out of the way is that you can't really play as other characters in the game like you can in other Final Fantasies. Instead, it is all focused on honing your action skills for one character. Aside from that, as an action game, I think it is extremely solid. The versatility alone inspires so much creativity and combo potential. Each Eikon has a special ability called an Eikon feat. Each of them provides a unique way to approach your enemies. For instance, you have Phoenix, who can dash towards enemies and close in gaps, Garudas, where you can pull enemies towards you, or late game icons like Shiva, where you can freeze any enemy in place. And if you're lucky to dodge at just the right moment, you can freeze them for an even more extended period of time. There is no order to your setup or what you're able to use. So with every playthrough you watch, you'll most likely see people using a setup completely different from your own. And even now, when coming back to this game, I am still finding new things to do within the combat. What I admire about it so much is the fact that you have the freedom to do whatever you want. I hear a lot of people complain that it doesn't have any elemental weaknesses, but that would actually stand against what a combo action game stands for. These type of action games are all about creativity and giving the player the freedom to combo with literally anything they want. The whole point of it is that you're able to express yourself the way you want through the combat. A lot of people want to treat this game like a strategy RPG, but the reality of it is that it is a true action game more than it is anything else. You have to learn to embrace the idea of learning combos alongside trying to balance that with DPS. I've learned that embracing it for the combo action game that it is, rather than looking at it for what it's not, has really given me an even deeper appreciation for the combat. If you can manage practicing combos and finding builds that work for you, I guarantee you will love this game, especially if you enjoy action games like me. The soundtrack. Unsurprisingly, the soundtrack in Final Fantasy XVI is absolutely stellar. With the setting being more medieval and going back to that classic fantasy style, the soundtrack reflects that very well. The composer, Masayoshi Soken, excels at bringing such a unique take on the orchestral style. What's even cooler is the fact that Soken also takes a bunch of inspiration and motifs from past Final Fantasy games into 16. For instance, the battle theme may sound very familiar to some of you. And there are many other callbacks within the soundtrack to many Final Fantasy games here. He does this all while delivering a soundtrack that could stand amongst some of the greats in the series. I kid you not, he created some tracks in here that will definitely become iconic in the next couple of years. And it fits his reputation, because if you've heard his work in Final Fantasy XIV, you'll know that Soken is pretty much a legend at Square Enix at this point. He's most well known for his variety in music, so in this game, he just couldn't help but to flaunt his musical style. Here's an example of some of my personal favorites. A soundtrack so good that there was just no way it wasn't going to win Best Score of the Year. The Eikon fights. The biggest selling point in 16, besides it being a Final Fantasy, are the breathtaking Eikon fights. I've said this a lot in my Final Fantasy based videos, but 16 is a game that had my jaw on the floor with every single boss fight in this game. I mean, they are something else. The hype I felt when playing literally every single one of them was like no other. These Eikon fights strive to bring some of the most cinematic and epic moments you have ever seen in a video game. I remember thinking as a kid how cool it would be to fight the summons at this type of scale. It's going to be really hard to top how they're portrayed in this game. Unlike other Final Fantasies where the summons are pretty much just cool cutscenes or creatures that do the fighting for you, in 16 you are fighting these summons in real time on such a large scale that Final Fantasy has not seen before. It is something that Final Fantasy 15 tried to do but couldn't get there quite yet. Unsurprisingly, the Eikon fights is where a lot of the budget for 16 went to. But looking back on it, these bosses are both a blessing and a curse, because these Eikon fights alone were so expensive it ended up spreading the rest of the budget for the game very thin. And that is where the next topic for the video comes in: game design. Perhaps the biggest criticism of this game has to do with the pacing and the quest design. Unfortunately, with the amazing Eikon fights, top-of-the-line visuals, and voice acting came at the cost of well-balanced pacing and any interesting quest structure. You'll go from having these more linear-focused mission areas and big story beats, and then right after that, long stretches of downtime that can kill the story pacing. There are a lot of games that have downtime moments similar to 16. However, in this game, the transitions between the two are so noticeable and drastic that it can definitely kill the flow of the story at times. If you're someone who really does not like game design that's just go from A marker to B marker with not much variation between in design, then this will be a rough experience for you. The game is structured like an MMO, which isn't surprising when you consider that Final Fantasy 16 is made by the same developer who worked on the very popular MMO Final Fantasy 14. However, I do think that they overestimated how well an MMO type of structure would work in a more single-player AAA title. And that's really unfortunate because everything outside of the game design for 16 I absolutely love. When it comes to the story, the combat, the boss fights, the characters, and the voice acting, all of it is top tier. And it's not surprising when the game can turn a lot of people off because of the game's pacing and very uninspired quest design. But if it's any game developer who can learn from that, it is definitely Creative Studio 3. DLC. Originally, there weren't plans for any DLC during the development of Final Fantasy 16. However, with the game seeing very good launch numbers and popular demand to see more of the world of Valencia, they were able to use concepts and bits of lore that were written ambiguously into the game originally. The developers were definitely aware that they had to write the story in the base game in a way that didn't have need for any DLC to wrap up any major story plot points. The main story of Final Fantasy 16 was a lot more coherent and complete than anything we had in 15. And the DLCs only really served to enhance the world around Clive and the people within Valencia. The Echoes of the Fallen DLC gave us a bit more insight on the ancient civilization that we know little of, and even fight the remnants that are scattered throughout the game. But it's something that's more in the background than it is at the forefront of the story. It's a DLC that serves to shed more light on their civilization and their history with Ultima. A fun little piece of content that also brings in a really iconic super boss from the franchise. They wrote the Leviathan story in a way that wasn't super integral to the base game story, and I'm actually very glad that it turned out that way. The way in which icons work within 16 would make you think that Leviathan would be extremely important to the base game of the story. It's written in a way to where it doesn't need Leviathan for Clive's growth. You can easily skip these DLC and still get the full package of Final Fantasy 16 story. Both pieces of DLC only really serve to add more context to the lore of the world that we only get to hear a little bit about in the base game. And I think they do a fantastic job of keeping that extra content as just that, extra content, and not something that is required to complete the overall experience. The ambiguous ending. Since this game has been out, there have been many opinions about the ending, both positive and negative. One thing is certain amongst everyone, and that is that the ending leaves you with more than a few questions. And to be fair, it's an ending that's supposed to make you feel that way. I think it beautifully wrapped up the themes of the game while also keeping it just ambiguous enough so that people could have their own interpretation of the ending. For me, the great thing about Final Fantasy XVI's ending is the fact that you choose how the story ends. Much like the themes of the game of free will and having that choice. In the end, it brings those themes together, and what matters is what the player takes from it. I personally believe that stories that don't have a set-in-stone answer all the time, but require the viewer to look back at the story and context clues to come up with their own interpretation, that to me is far more invaluable. That story ends up becoming a lot more than what the author had intended simply because of the interpretation of the people. It'll go on to be this whole living story that continues for years and years. I think having the author state an answer when it's not intended for the story can be very unnecessary. So what do I believe? Well, I'm of the mindset that Clive survived and wrote the book. There are many clues that point to that conclusion, including the Harpocrates side quests and the fact that Clive is the narrator of the story. He's also the one who not only directly quotes Final Fantasy within the story, but with the names of Muthos being Clive and a name like Ultima, Muthos and Ultima translates to Final Fantasy. I think it's only fitting for Clive to be the one who wrote the book because he is the one who has experienced every single pivotal moment within the story. But that is just how I see it, and again, there are so many interpretations of the story that aren't mine that could still work. And that's all thanks to how well crafted the story itself is, and how even the side quests are able to serve as context clues for the very ending. Though for me, what I find even more special is the very last end credit scene. We see two boys reminiscent of Clive and Joshua living a peaceful life. One that isn't bound by the mother crystals, but one that is reliant on the strength of mankind. What I love is how the themes of the story come full circle when the boy lights the flame with his own hands, showing that man has no need for the crystals or its blessing to survive. It's also an environmentalist message that can call back to Final Fantasy VII, to let go of the luxury that technology brings for the good of the planet. This isn't a mankind that is overly reliant on the mother crystals to the point where they can't even light a fire or fill a well without crystals. This is a new mankind as a result of Clive's actions that can rely on their strength alone to live their life. It's this entire ending of Final Fantasy XVI that perfectly brings back the themes of the game and fulfills the dream that Cid had. The themes of free will and being the ruler of your own fate, taking your life into your own hands rather than under the oppression of another. It is all very well done. Final Fantasy XVI will most likely be seen as one of the bigger turning points within the series. It is an entry that harkens back to classic Final Fantasy vibes while also trying to provide a new gameplay experience in the series for fans. And I truly believe that this is one of the better single-player Final Fantasy experiences in the past 20 years. I mean, besides the remake trilogy, I think that Final Fantasy XVI is the full package regardless of its shortcomings. And any Final Fantasy fan, whether you're newer to the series or a veteran, you should definitely give this game a try. I definitely have problems with the quest design and pacing of 16, but in my experience, I didn't find them to be game-breaking in any way or so underwhelming to the point where I lost interest in the story. I think the positives are just so good that I didn't really mind the slower, downtime moments as much as others. But I do acknowledge those criticisms when it comes to those areas of the game. I think the story and the characters are very well crafted here, and the themes of free will are portrayed so perfectly that it really made me look at a lot of characters I didn't like at first and perceive them in a much different light. The combat is some of the most versatile gameplay I have ever gotten to experience, especially for an action game fan like me. They really did an amazing job making sure that nothing in the game restricts you from really trying everything. And I think because of that, the combo potential really makes for some exhilarating gameplay. It really gave a new flair to Final Fantasy that I can definitely appreciate. I know some may not enjoy the direction of modern Final Fantasy, but I think it's worth realizing that this is probably the safest franchise to be able to have drastic changes like this. I believe the reason why this franchise could go on for as long as it has is because it's able to create a fresh new experience every single time. And though some consistency in gameplay between new releases would be nice, I am content with the fact that developers are able to have free reign to create something never seen in the franchise before. I think it is extremely healthy for not only games, but developers. It is not a series that has lost its identity because Final Fantasy as a franchise means so much more than just one aspect of a game. Final Fantasy isn't defined by just gameplay. It is its stories, its themes, its characters, its chocobos and moogles, its Cids, and at the end of the day, not everyone is going to enjoy a certain Final Fantasy, and that is completely fine. But to say that these games are not Final Fantasies simply because they don't have an aspect of a game that you don't like, I think that is being very disingenuous to what the franchise as a whole represents. But hey, that's just my opinion, and Final Fantasy will mean different things to everybody, and that's just the reality of it. Regardless of how mature and dark this Final Fantasy is compared to others, at the end of the day, it still captures the heart of what Final Fantasy is. It's about hope, love, compassion, and empathy for those around you. The freedom to live your life the way that you want to live it. And ultimately, that is Final Fantasy 16.